August 21st, 1942. Just after 9 p.m., the air along the Tenaru River went still. The Marines dug into the sandbar could hear it first. Not voices, not engines, just the faint rustle of movement through the jungle across the water. Something was coming. Most of them had been in uniform for less than a year. Some had fired their rifles maybe twice before landing on this island 3 weeks ago. They were kids from Iowa and Texas and Pennsylvania, and they were scared. But they stayed in their holes. Across the river, Colonel Ichiki stood with his men in the dark. He had 916 soldiers behind him. Every one of them was trained. Every one of them had seen combat in China. They were elite troops, and they had never lost a battle. Ichiki believed the Americans in front of him were broken. His intelligence reports said the Marines were sick, hungry, and ready to run. He thought one hard push would send them back into the ocean. He was wrong. The plan was simple. Wait until the middle of the night, cross the river in silence, hit the American line with bayonets and swords. No guns at first, just steel and speed and shock. The Americans would panic. They always did. That was the doctrine. That was what worked in China, in Malaya, in the Philippines. Japanese commanders had used the night charge for years, and it had broken enemy after enemy. The terror of it was the weapon. Men who could fight in daylight would freeze in the dark when hundreds of soldiers came screaming out of nowhere with blades. Ichiki had no doubt it would work again. At 1:30 a.m., he gave the order. The first wave moved into the river. The water was shallow, but the current pulled at their legs. They crossed slowly, trying to stay quiet. Some of them made it to the sandbar. They crouched low, waiting for the rest to catch up. Then the shooting started. The Marines on the line had been watching the river for hours. They saw the shadows moving in the water. They heard the splashing. And when the Japanese soldiers stepped onto the sand, the machine guns opened up. Tracer rounds lit up the night like fireworks. The sound was enormous. The Marines kept firing, kept reloading, kept firing again. The Japanese soldiers in the water had nowhere to go. Some tried to run forward. Some tried to go back. Most of them just fell. Ichiki watched from the far side of the river. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. His men were supposed to be across by now. They were supposed to be inside the American position, fighting hand to hand. Instead, they were dying in the open. He sent the second wave. This time, they came with battle cries, hundreds of voices screaming at once, trying to bring the terror back. They charged into the river, bayonets up, moving fast. The Marines shot them down. It wasn't skill, it wasn't experience, it was just firepower. The kids in the holes had rifles and machine guns and orders to hold the line, so they did. They fired until their barrels were hot. They fired until their hands were shaking. They fired until the river was full of bodies. By 3 a.m., the charge was over. Ichiki pulled his men back into the jungle. He had lost more than half of them. The rest were scattered, broken, and bleeding. The night charge had failed. For the first time in the war, Japanese infantry had been stopped cold by American troops. And the Americans weren't even veterans. When the sun came up, the Marines could see what they had done. The sandbar was covered in bodies. The river was still. Some of the Japanese soldiers were floating face down in the shallow water. Others were piled up near the edge of the American line, close enough that you could see their faces. The Marines didn't say much. They just looked. Most of them had never killed anyone before last night. Now they had killed hundreds. Some of them threw up. Some of them sat down and stared at nothing. A few of them walked back to their foxholes and tried to sleep. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock walked the line that morning. He was the battalion commander, and he needed to see his men. He needed to know if they were still functional. They were quiet, but they were still there. Pollock knew what had happened was bigger than one night. The Japanese had thrown their best troops at Green Marines, and the Marines had held. That wasn't supposed to happen. Not according to the intelligence reports. Not according to what everyone believed about Japanese infantry. But it did happen. Across the river, Colonel Ichiki was trying to understand it too. He sat in the jungle with what was left of his regiment. Maybe 400 men, maybe less. He had started with 916. The rest were dead or missing or too hurt to move. He wrote a message to his superiors. It was short. It said the Americans were stronger than expected. It said the night attack had failed. It said he needed reinforcements. Then he waited for a reply. It didn't come. Ichiki had been told that the Americans on Guadalcanal were weak. He had been told they were falling apart. He had been told one good attack would finish them. Every piece of intelligence pointed to an easy victory. But the intelligence was wrong. The Marines weren't weak, they were just inexperienced. And inexperience doesn't matter as much when you have machine guns and a defensive position and orders to hold. Ichiki didn't know what to do. His entire strategy had been built on the idea that the enemy would break. When they didn't, he had no backup plan. By midday, the Marines started moving. They didn't wait for the Japanese to regroup. They crossed the river and pushed into the jungle. Tanks came up from the beach. Artillery started firing into the trees. The Marines moved slowly, carefully, clearing the ground as they went. The Japanese soldiers were still alive, tried to fight back. Some of them fired from behind logs, some of them charged with bayonets, one or two at a time. It didn't matter. The Marines had momentum now. By the afternoon, Ichiki's regiment was gone. Some of the men were killed in the jungle, some of them ran toward the coast and were cut down by machine gun fire. A few of them made it back to the beach and tried to swim away. The Marines shot them in the water. Ichiki himself walked into the jungle alone. He didn't try to escape, he didn't try to surrender. He just went deeper into the trees, and no one saw him again. Later, the Marines found a Japanese officer's body with a sword next to it. They assumed it was him. They never confirmed it. Back at Japanese headquarters, the news started to come in. The Ichiki regiment was destroyed. The night attack had failed. The Americans were still on Guadalcanal and they weren't leaving. The commanders didn't understand it. They had sent elite troops. They had used proven tactics. They had done everything right. But the Marines had stayed in their holes and kept shooting. That was the part that didn't make sense. Japanese doctrine said that inexperienced soldiers would panic under a night attack. It said they would run or freeze or break apart. It had always worked that way. Until now. The officers started asking questions. Who were these Marines? How long had they been trained? Why didn't they collapse? The answers didn't help. The Marines were new. Most of them had been civilians a year ago. They weren't special forces. They weren't veterans. They were just regular American kids with rifles, and they had stopped the best Japan had. Within a week, every Japanese command post in the Pacific had heard about the Tenaru River. The reports came in pieces at first, radio messages, survivor accounts, intelligence summaries, but they all said the same thing. The Ichiki regiment was gone. The night charge had failed. The Americans had held. For Japanese officers who had fought in China and Southeast Asia, this didn't make sense. The night bayonet charge wasn't just a tactic, it was psychological warfare. It was designed to break the enemy's will before the fight even started. You didn't need to kill everyone, you just needed to make them afraid. And once they were afraid, they would run. It had worked in Shanghai, it had worked in Singapore, it had worked in the Philippines. But at Guadalcanal, the Americans didn't run. General Harukichi Hyakutake read the reports at his headquarters in Rabaul. He was the commander of the 17th Army, and Guadalcanal was his problem now. He didn't blame Ichiki. Ichiki had followed orders. He had used the right tactics. He had done what any Japanese officer would have done. But the result was a disaster. Hyakutake needed to know why, so he called in his intelligence officers and asked them to explain how 900 elite soldiers had been wiped out by a group of inexperienced Marines. The officers didn't have a good answer. They said the Americans had more firepower than expected. They said the Marines had been dug in and waiting. They said the terrain made it hard to maneuver. All of that was true, but it didn't explain the real problem. The real problem was that the Americans didn't break. Japanese tactics relied on fear. The whole point of the night charge was to create chaos, to make the enemy panic, to turn soldiers into a crowd of scared men running in different directions. But the Marines at Tenaru didn't panic. They stayed in their positions. They fired their weapons. They followed orders. Hyakutake started to wonder if the doctrine needed to change. Other commanders didn't agree. They said Ichiki had just been unlucky. They said the Americans had been lucky. They said the next attack would be different. So Hyakutake approved the next attack. In early September, he sent a larger force to Guadalcanal. This time, it was a full brigade, more than 6,000 men. They landed on the island and moved through the jungle toward the Marine positions. The plan was almost the same. Wait until night, hit the Americans hard, break their line, push them back to the beach. But this time, the Japanese commanders were more careful. They scouted the American positions, they brought more artillery, they planned multiple waves. On the night of September 12th, they attacked. The Marines were ready. The fighting lasted 2 days. The Japanese soldiers charged again and again. They came through the jungle, they came across open ground, they came at night and during the day, and the Marines kept shooting. By September 14th, the Japanese had lost more than 1,200 men. The Marines had lost 40. The attack failed. Hyakutake got the news at his desk in Rabaul. He sat there for a long time, reading the reports over and over. 2 attacks, 2 failures, thousands of men dead. He started to realize something that most of the other commanders didn't want to admit. The Americans were different. They didn't fight like the Chinese troops Japan had faced in Manchuria. They didn't fight like the British in Malaya. They didn't collapse under pressure. They didn't retreat when things got hard. They just kept firing. Hyakutake wrote a memo to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. He told them that the situation on Guadalcanal was more serious than anyone had thought. He told them that the Americans were well-armed and well-trained. He told them that the night charge wasn't working anymore. The memo was ignored. Tokyo still believed that one more big attack would finish the Marines. They sent more troops, they sent more supplies, they told Hyakutake to keep trying. So he did. In October, the Japanese launched their largest assault yet, more than 20,000 troops, multiple attacks from different directions, artillery, tanks, air support. The Marines held. Every single attack was stopped. Every charge broke apart under machine gun fire. Every attempt to break the line failed. By the end of October, the Japanese had lost more than 3,500 men in a single week, and the Marines were still there. Back in Tokyo, the reports kept coming in, each one worse than the last. The commanders started to argue. Some of them said the tactics were wrong. Some of them said the intelligence was wrong. Some of them said the whole strategy was wrong. But no one wanted to say the obvious thing. The obvious thing was that the doctrine had failed. The night charge didn't work anymore. Not against troops with automatic weapons and radios and air support. Not against soldiers who had been trained to hold their ground. The psychological weapon that Japan had used for years was broken. And it broke at Guadalcanal, on a sandbar next to a river, when a group of Green Marines decided not to run. By November 1942, the Japanese army had a problem it didn't know how to solve. Guadalcanal was supposed to be a minor operation, a quick fight, a chance to push the Americans back and secure the Solomon Islands. But it had turned into something else. It had turned into a test, and Japan was failing. The commanders in Tokyo kept sending reinforcements. Destroyers would race down from Rabaul at night, drop off troops and supplies, and race back before sunrise. The Americans called it the Tokyo Express. The Japanese called it the Rat Run. Either way, it wasn't enough. Every time new troops arrived on Guadalcanal, they were told the same thing. The Americans are weak. One more attack will break them. Just hit them hard at night and they'll collapse. But when the attacks came, the Marines didn't collapse. They stayed in their foxholes. They called in artillery. They fired their machine guns until the barrels glowed. And when the sun came up, the jungle was full of Japanese bodies. The soldiers who survived started to talk. They said the Americans fought differently. They said the Marines didn't care about honor or tradition. They just cared about killing you before you could kill them. They said the night attacks didn't scare the Americans anymore. That last part was the hardest to accept. For years, Japanese officers had been taught that spirit mattered more than firepower, that discipline and courage could overcome any advantage the enemy had, that a soldier who was willing to die could defeat a soldier who wanted to live. But the Marines weren't trying to live. They were just trying to hold the line, and they had enough bullets to do it. Lieutenant General Tadayoshi Sano was one of the officers who saw it clearly. He had been on Guadalcanal since October, and he had watched attack after attack get torn apart. In late November, he sent a report to his superiors. He didn't use careful language. He didn't try to soften the message. He said the night charge was obsolete. He said American firepower was too strong. He said their defensive positions were too well built. He said sending men across open ground in the dark was just sending them to die. He said the tactics needed to change. The report was read, it was discussed, and then it was set aside. Tokyo wasn't ready to admit that the doctrine had failed. Changing the doctrine meant admitting that thousands of men had died for nothing. It meant admitting that the Army's entire approach to infantry combat was wrong. So they kept using the same tactics. In December, the Japanese tried again. Another night attack. Another wave of soldiers charging through the jungle with bayonets. The Marines were waiting. This time, they had radar. They could see the Japanese troops moving in the dark. They could call in artillery before the attack even started. By the time the soldiers reached the American line, half of them were already dead. The rest were cut down by machine gun fire. When the attack ended, the Japanese had lost more than 800 men. The Marines had lost 12. After that, the talking stopped. The officers on Guadalcanal stopped pretending the attacks were working. The soldiers stopped believing they could win. Everyone just wanted to leave. In early January 1943, Tokyo finally gave the order: evacuate Guadalcanal. It took 3 weeks. Destroyers came at night and pulled men off the beaches. Thousands of soldiers were left behind. Some of them starved. Some of them were captured. Some of them walked into the jungle and never came out. By February 9th, the island was empty. The Americans had won. But the real victory wasn't about the island. It was about what happened to the Japanese army after Guadalcanal. The night charge was never the same again. Commanders stopped using it as their main tactic. They stopped believing it would break the enemy. They stopped teaching young officers that spirit and steel could win battles on their own. The doctrine didn't disappear. Japanese soldiers still charged with bayonets. They still fought at night. They still believed in sacrifice. But they didn't believe it would make the Americans run. Because at Guadalcanal, the Americans had proven something. They had proven that inexperience didn't mean weakness, that being new didn't mean being soft, that a kid from Iowa with a rifle could stop an elite soldier from Tokyo if he had enough bullets and enough reason to stay. The Japanese commanders had expected the Marines to break. They had built their entire strategy around that expectation. And when it didn't happen, they didn't know what to do. So they kept attacking, kept losing, kept sending men into machine gun fire because the doctrine said it should work. By the time they realized it wouldn't, thousands of soldiers were already dead.
The Marines who survived Guadalcanal didn't talk about it much. They didn't brag. They didn't call themselves heroes. Most of them just said they did what they were told. They stayed in their holes. They fired their guns. They didn't run. That was enough. After the war, some of the Japanese officers who survived Guadalcanal were interviewed. They were asked what went wrong, why the attacks failed, what they thought when the Marines didn't break. Their answers were quiet, careful, but they were honest. Colonel Tsuji Masanobu had been a staff officer during the Guadalcanal campaign. He helped plan some of the attacks. He read all the reports. When he was asked about the night charges, he said something simple: "We thought they would be afraid." That was it. That was the whole strategy. Make the Americans afraid and they would lose. But the Marines weren't afraid, or if they were, they didn't show it. Tsuji said the intelligence reports had told them the Americans were inexperienced, that they had only been training for a few months, that most of them had never been in combat. All of that was true, but the reports didn't mention the firepower. They didn't mention the radios. They didn't mention the fact that American doctrine was built around supporting the infantry with everything available: mortars, artillery, machine guns, air support. The Japanese soldiers were trained to charge. The American soldiers were trained to call for help, and help always came. Tsuji said that after the first attack failed, some of the younger officers started asking questions. They wanted to know why the night charge didn't work. They wanted to know if there was a different way to fight. But the senior commanders didn't want to hear it. They said the tactics were fine. They said the execution was the problem. They said the next attack would succeed if the soldiers just fought harder. So the soldiers fought harder, and they died faster. Another officer, Captain Sakamoto Takeo, was on the ground during the September attacks. He led a company of infantry through the jungle and across the American line. Or he tried to. He said the hardest part wasn't the bullets, it was the sound. American machine guns didn't stop. They just kept firing. One gun would go quiet and another one would start. There was no gap, no pause, no moment to move forward. Sakamoto said his men tried to charge 3 times. Each time, they made it a few meters and then had to fall back. By the third attempt, most of his company was gone. He said he reported the situation to his commander. He said the American position was too strong. He said they needed artillery support or a different approach. The commander told him to attack again, so he did. By the time the sun came up, Sakamoto had 11 men left. He had started with more than 180. When he was asked what he thought about the American Marines, he said they weren't special. They just had more guns than we did. That was the truth that most Japanese commanders didn't want to accept. It wasn't about courage. It wasn't about training. It wasn't about spirit. It was about firepower. The Americans had it, the Japanese didn't, and no amount of bravery could fix that. General Hayakute never spoke publicly about Guadalcanal, but his staff officers did. They said he was frustrated, not angry, just frustrated. He had followed the doctrine. He had used the tactics that worked in China. He had sent good soldiers into battle with clear orders. And it didn't matter. One of his aides said Hayakute kept asking the same question after each failed attack. Why won't they run? He couldn't understand it. In every other campaign, the enemy had broken, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, but they always broke. The Marines didn't. The aide said Hayakute finally stopped asking the question in December. By then, he knew the answer. The Americans weren't going to run, not at Guadalcanal, not anywhere. After the evacuation, Hayakute was reassigned. He spent the rest of the war in the Philippines. He never talked about Guadalcanal again. But other officers did. They talked about it in quiet conversations, in letters, in reports that were filed away and forgotten. They said the night charge was finished. They said the old tactics didn't work anymore. They said the army needed to adapt. Some of them were listened to, some of them weren't. But the doctrine started to change. Not all at once, not officially, but slowly. Over the next 2 years, Japanese commanders stopped relying on the bayonet charge as their main weapon. They started using more artillery, more defensive positions, more ambushes. They stopped believing that one hard push would break the Americans, because at Guadalcanal, they had pushed as hard as they could, and the Americans had pushed back harder. The Marines who held the line that night in August didn't know they were changing the war. They didn't know that Japanese officers would spend years trying to figure out what went wrong. They just knew they had a job to do. Stay in the hole, fire the gun, don't run. That was it. And it was enough to stop an empire.